right. So, Earth Day was first celebrated 56 years ago on April 22nd, 1970. Back then, my biggest concerns were air and water pollution. I was appalled and thought our health would all be terrible. So I'm really delighted that so many of you are interested on the impacts of data centers on water and that you're joining us this evening. Our groups will have a listing of all of them. Plan on hosting two additional webinars, one in May and one in June. The second one will be on land use and economics, and the last one being on electricity usage, climate change, and air pollution, primarily from backup diesel generators. My name is Catherine Thomason. I work as the lobby organizer for MCAT, Mobilizing Climate Action Together, and the chair of the work group for the Oregon Democrats statewide environmental caucus. Next slide. I am so pleased to be joined by speakers working here in Oregon, trying to protect Oregon's land and waters for the communities and for our environment. The first speaker is Caleb Lay, Director of Policy and Research with Oregon Rural Action, a grassroots organizing group in Northeast Oregon. He's the leading expert in pollution and water issues in the lower Umatilla Basin, which is one of the worst sacrifice zones in our state, and Oregon's fastest growing high intensity data center hub. Ben Gordon is the Executive Director of Central Oregon Land Watch since 2020, providing vision and strategic leadership as the organization has evolved to meet the demands of a fast-growing region. Kelsey Shaw Nakama is the Policy and Advocacy Director for Tualatin Riverkeepers. She's a lawyer with certification in environmental and natural resource law. So, next slide. I'm just going to have a couple of background slides. This one is very busy, but basically, the definition of a data center is essentially a warehoused collection of computers for building, running, and delivering applications and services. The designation of the different types of data centers, as you can see on the left-hand side of the slides, goes by decade. So back in the 1990s, the first data centers were company-owned and operated, typically located on site of the business, and the power use was in the kilowatt range to 1 megawatt. It used air conditioning primarily to cool itself. And 1 megawatt can run on average US homes, about 800 homes. The second that started in the 2000s were multi-tenant data centers or co-location plants. Their electricity use is in the tens of megawatts. So anywhere from 8,000 to 50,000 homes could be run by the electricity they consume. These types are typically located in Hillsborough and Portland, and several in Eugene. The third began in the 2010s when we started having significant cloud computing. They're hyperscale computer data centers. They can be air cooled or water cooled. The power use in this circumstance is in the range of hundreds of megawatts. And just for comparison, a typical coal or natural gas burning electricity plant produces 300 to 400 megawatts. So you could say that one of these large data center campuses need an entire electricity plant to run them. And then the last are the newest hyperscale AI data centers. Um, Caleb probably knows more about this. We have one in the planning phase or building phase, and it uses in the range of gigawatt of electricity, which is the size of a large nuclear power plant. Um, Next slide. This is a map of Oregon, obviously, and I took this information from the datacentermap.com website, and and it shows where we have most of our data centers. 40 in Hillsborough, 31 in Boardman, 33 in both Hermiston and Umatilla, 6 in the Dalles, 12 in Portland, and so on. Um, they're clumped, as you can see, because data centers need and want to connect to high-grade fiber optic cables. Oregon has 10 of those cables, international cables coming into our state. 3 go to Hillsborough and others go up the Columbia River. Data centers want lower cost electricity and, of course, lots of it. Water for cooling these behemoths. And Oregon is number 2 or 3 in the world for data centers after Virginia and possibly Beijing. However, Texas may soon outbuild us as they're building faster, at a faster pace than we currently are. So moving to the next slide, I will transition it to Caleb from Oregon Rural Action.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. I got some thumbs up. Thank you, Catherine. Never fun to follow Catherine. It's like all downhill from there. Thank you for the introduction, Catherine. Really great to be here. And thanks to everybody who's watching online. I know it's not the easiest thing to take time out of an evening in the middle of the week. So really appreciate everybody being here. Like Catherine said, my name is Caleb Lay. I work with Oregon Rural Action. We're a small nonprofit that works up here in Northeast Oregon. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that Northeast Oregon section Catherine was talking about, Morrow and Umatilla counties. Can you go to the next slide for me, Ben? Yeah,
And before
that's
you
really,
start
oh,
going, let me just say that people can put their questions in the chat. We will try and bundle them and have a small segment of Q&A after each speaker, and then more Q&A time at the end. Thanks.
perfect. And I love questions, so bring them on. Um, so this is sort of the area we're talking about on that map. You can see it in the little red box. It's the LGWAMA. You might have heard of that acronym before. It's a terrible one. It stands for Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area. It's 500-600 square miles, somewhere in there. And like Catherine mentioned, I refer to it as the worst sacrifice zone in Oregon. Next slide, please. This is a quick rundown of all the issues that we have pollution-wise there. Um, Really widespread drinking water contamination by nitrate, as well as some emerging signs that we have a PFAS issue. Some of the worst industrial air pollution in the state. 42 to 43% of the entire state of Oregon's industrial air pollution from large facilities is concentrated in that little red box. It's also one of the most profitable regions in Oregon, literally billions of dollars in economic output every single year. The Port of Morrow alone claims $2.3 million in daily economic output. Uh, it's disproportionately low income, blue collar, working class. It's also disproportionately non-English speaking. And believe it or not, out here in Northeast Oregon, one of the most diverse and most quickly diversifying places in Oregon. All of that is far from coincidental. You don't have that much economic productivity, that much pollution, and that diverse and working class community all in one place unless you've got some economic justice and environmental justice issues. Next slide, please, Ben. And again, all that is happening right there in that small little area up in Northeast Oregon. Next slide, please. So that's zoomed in on that little red box, and each one of these little red squares is a data center campus in the Lower Umatilla Basin. Most of the resources out there in the world are an undercount. By my count, the built, under construction, and in the pipeline campuses in the Lower Umatilla Basin are very, very conservative estimate, 88 data centers. Will be well into triple digits here very soon. The growth is happening very, very rapidly. Now, we're focused on water for this conversation tonight, and in the Lower Umatilla Basin, there are sort of two connected main concerns around how data centers interact with water and affect water in our communities. Can I go next slide, please? Oh, and it got all messed up. Bear with me on the formatting. The first concern we have is water consumption. How much water do data centers use? And I wanted to outline three just basic facts, three truths. Truth number one, they do use a lot of water, and it's staggering the degree to which they can use it. These are on the scale of small cities, right? A single data center campus at the hyperscale level can use as much water as tens of thousands of homes will use in an entire year. Fact number two, truth number two, there is no such thing as a closed loop system in the lower Umatilla Basin. They are highly water consumptive. They bring water in, they lose water in their operations because they use evaporation by design. That water is being lost into the atmosphere. Uh, Anytime you hear someone say they're closed loop, take that with a boulder of salt. Fact number three, data centers use much, much more water in the hot summer months than they do in the winter. Makes sense, right? They're using it to keep their servers cool, so in the hotter months, they need more of it. Next slide, please, Ben. So let's jump in with an example. These graphs are of three of the data center campuses in Boardman that we actually have pretty good data on. And I want to just throw out a small caveat that we don't have great data on most of them. Transparency leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to data centers in the Lower Umatilla Basin, and I think more generally as well. But with these three, you can see the three graphs that are just red. That's water use over the course of the year, and in the bottom right, that's the average temperature over the course of the year. And you can see when the temperature goes up, the water use goes up. It's not rocket science, right? Next slide, please, Ben. In total, those three data center campuses, and you can see them, they're pretty small in the map there in the middle of Boardman. They used 40 million gallons of water just in 2025. Again, that's just three of the campuses. One more slide, Ben. This is all the campuses that we have to deal with. So we have a bit of a problem because those three are using literally tens of millions of gallons of water. Meanwhile, the other 16 campuses that we know of, 16 plus with more on the way, we don't know how much water they're using. That is a big problem, especially when you consider that this is a place. I mean, look at all those little green patches on that map. Highly water intensive area, high reliance on water, both for agriculture, for the local economy. And like I mentioned earlier, this area has drinking water problems. Data centers are being supplied with tens of millions of gallons of fresh water. Meanwhile, thousands of human beings and families in this region do not have drinking water coming through the pipes in their homes. Their water's polluted. And that takes me to our next concern. Thank you, Ben. Water contamination, my bread and butter. Some of you may have heard in the news about a settlement Amazon reached over a lawsuit having to do with this exact thing that I'm talking about. And basically, I've got some really appetizing pictures of Jello and syrup there on the screen, you might have noticed. Um, Basically, the process of making Jello or making simple syrup on your stovetop is what happens in data centers. Imagine you're making simple syrup. You start with water, you add sugar, maybe you throw a little lavender in there if you're feeling frisky, and then you boil off the water, right? You increase the concentration of the sugar and you wind up with syrup. Same sort of thing is happening with data centers. They pull water into their facilities, and oftentimes, especially in the lower Umatilla Basin, that water already has contaminants in it. Then they can add things like biocides and descaling agents to prevent things from growing on the inside of those pipes, right? And as they cycle that water through over and over again, they lose that water to evaporation, oftentimes by design. Now, in Amazon's language, and all of these campuses in this region are Amazon, uh, they cycle that water until it is, quote, no longer suitable for mechanical cooling, and then they discharge it. In some cases, they evaporate it off completely. In other cases, they dump it on farmland in order to dispose of it under the guise of reuse. Now, when that farmland then gets overloaded with more fertilizer, more water, those contaminants can move back down into the groundwater and the water table. So even though data centers take nitrate, for example, they don't add any nitrate to their water, but by using and reusing that water, they exacerbate contamination issues. Next slide, please, Ben. This is a direct example I wanted to go through, and I'll go through very quickly because I'm running out of time. This is PDX 90. It's another data center in Boardman that gets its drinking water from the city of Boardman, I believe. Now, in July 2025, nitrate in the city of Boardman's drinking water was 4.26, which is actually high enough that I myself wouldn't drink it, and I wouldn't recommend anyone else drink it. Uh, Water going into that data center, presumably pretty close to that, right? A month later, in August 2025, the water coming out of that facility was at 23.9. So that's more than a five-fold increase in that one contaminant, just nitrate. Other data center campuses in the region, we've seen increases as much as eightfold. Now, think about not just nitrate, but lead, PFAS, any other contaminant that you don't want getting, one, into your drinking water, but two, out onto farmland and into the food supply. All right, one more slide, please, Ben. This brings me to the big one. Amazon's exascale campus. Going to add one more category to that list that Catherine had. We have 19 data center campuses at the hyperscale level, either built, under construction, or in planning. One more slide, please, Ben. Now, this is sort of the footprint of one of those hyperscale campuses in Eastern Oregon, that little red box. And it's, 100 acres, a little bit more somewhere in there. They're big, highly water consumptive, highly energy consumptive, big footprint. One more slide, please. That patch on the left is going to be the exascale campus. It's 1,300 acres. It's massive. So you can take all of these issues that we've been talking about with all these other data center campuses in this region, and you can just crank it up to 11, probably to 20, right? You make things bigger with, especially with regards to data centers with water consumption, you're just going to make the problems worse. And you got to consider the cumulative effect that having all of these campuses clustered in this area where we already have so many pollution issues, you got to consider how much worse that's going to make things. One more slide, please, Ben. That's essentially what it's going to look like. Basically, a network of four, possibly up to five hyperscale campuses all in one facility. The expectation is going to use 1,300 gallons per minute at peak use during the hot summer months when there's already not enough water to go around. That's four 5 gallon buckets, more than four 5 gallon buckets every second. I mean, look around the room that you're sitting in right now, and in the amount of time that I've been blabbing on, how full would that room be? How many times would it have filled up? We're talking about a monstrous amount of water. And this will be for generative AI. On top of that, we're talking about a gigawatt of energy. We're talking about a loss of 1,300 acres of historic grazing land, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million gallons per year of diesel consumption burned directly upwind of residential Boardman. And then on top of all of that, we're going to subsidize it with at least an expected $720 million in tax breaks. This is a problem, folks. It's not an easy problem to solve, but it is solvable. First things first, we just got to get the word out. We got to get people educated, and we got to band together, stand up against these data centers. That is what I've got for my presentation. I got through it as fast as I could. Hopefully, I'm on time, and yeah, I'll pass it on for questions or pass it on to Ben. Thanks, y'all.
Catherine,
I
do you
think
want? Oh, go
I
ahead.
think we have time for one or two questions if folks have questions for Caleb. River?
Um, yeah, so maybe this is for later, but like how what do we know about I mean, for me, I'm interested. How do I find out information about the data centers here in Portland? I know that's not your focus, but I wanted to like, how can I take what I'm having here and use it where I am and maybe build on that as well?
Hmm.
So
That,
there are policy section that will go into some of that. The Columbia River Keepers has put out a report of the various data centers that are along the Columbia, both in Washington and in Oregon. So they may have included those.
Okay.
Um, so that would be the first place I would go. But we'll talk about
And
resources and policy at the end.
the other question I had is how involved are government agencies like the Tualatin Parks and
Okay.
Rec, Water Conservation, or like those, like, do you know what I'm talking about? There are these like kind of small, little, almost obscure boards. Um, I don't know. Maybe this is for another area on politics too, but I was wondering if we know who is involved. Is it just city councils, or are there other areas?
Yeah, Caleb, could you answer that for your region?
yeah,
And then
sure.
the other people will probably speak to some of that in their presentation.
Yeah, and it varies, I think, a lot depending on which region you're looking at. Here in Northeast Oregon, for example, a lot of the western part of this region I'm talking about falls in Morrow County's jurisdiction. So you've got three county commissioners, some county planning officials, and also to a similar degree, you've got the Port of Morrow because they're supplying a lot of the water. So the best way to think about it is like start tracking down who are the decision makers associated here. Is this land in the city? Is it outside the city? That'll lead you to whether it's the city that you need to talk to or maybe the county. And look at planning commission documents, agenda packets, water rights and availability. I see in the chat. That's going to go through Oregon Water Resources Department. But by and large, we really do have an issue with transparency here. It should be pretty easy to look at, if there's a data center in your community, in your zip code, you should be able to find information about it pretty easily. And right now you can't. It's a hard thing to look up, which is why it's become a full-time job for people like me, right? That's a problem we need to solve.
Thank you, Caleb. And we'll transition to Ben.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kayla. I appreciated your presentation. Lots to think about. So here I am in Central Oregon. For folks that aren't familiar with the organization, I'm the executive director of Central Oregon Landwatch. We are place-based within the Deschutes Basin. We oversee all facets of environmental protection and compliance in Deschutes, Crook, and Jefferson counties, and we do statewide advocacy as well. So Prineville falls into our jurisdiction. And one of the things that struck me about Caleb's presentation is just how widespread the data center patchwork is up into the northeast of the state. And it got me thinking about future efforts and implications for an expanded database campus in Central Oregon and what that could portend for the Central Oregon region, lessons learned from Caleb. So, certainly a reminder to get involved, learn about what proposals are likely to befall your community, and get active in shaping them early. So in Prineville, this story sort of goes back about 15 years, almost 15 years. And I remember back in the early 2010s when it was a novel concept and an exciting one that Little Prineville was being courted or sought after by the likes of tech giants Apple and Meta. And at that time, there were some questions about the implications, but little was known, and we weren't facing the realities of what these data centers could become and the technology that they included, like hyperscaling, and how consumptive that can be. So I remember back then there were worries that these big warehouse type structures could consume so much of the available land, power, and water. And now, 15 years later, here we are realizing to what extent that is true. But to give you a sense of the sort of the quality of the landscape, it's often the case that speculators will look across a barren landscape. There's nothing here, therefore we can develop it. And I think that's often the misnomer that leads people to want to convert resource lands, open lands, farm forest lands that are critical for wildlife and carbon sequestration into whatever humans might try to tame them with. Data centers seems like a natural fit there. So Prineville area, and this topic is about water, and next month I'll speak about land use, so I'll keep it focused here. But the water that the 15 data centers consume, it's two campuses, about 500 acres, comes directly out of the ground from within the Crooked River Basin. And the Crooked River Basin, it's precarious already because of drought and the climate change that we're facing. It's a relatively low elevation basin, so the mountains aren't particularly high, and the snowpack has diminished significantly in recent years. So forecasts for what the water recharge might have been when there was lots more snowpack. For example, this year there's about 20% of normal snowpack, and so that affects how much water is repercolating back into the ground, which these data centers consume so much of. So essentially, it is a system that is slow to recharge at its best. And with all of the drawdowns, which I'll get into the specifics of, there are some real questions about the sustainability of the consumptive nature of these data centers as they're taking a greater share of the available water. So Prineville's municipal water, Caleb mentioned whether or not a data center is within city limits or an urban growth boundary or outside of. Those are different jurisdictions and jurisdictions that make the decisions. So within a city, cities use municipal water, and outside, it's typically agricultural water. There doesn't tend to be a municipal system. So in Prineville, the two data center companies, Meta and Apple, they're essentially municipal clients to the city. There's a total of 600 million gallons available per year, and that is for residential use, so people's homes, the taps in their homes, for any type of commercial use, and then the industrial use. So agriculture, because it's outside of the city, falls outside of that. Prineville is, I'll get to how much it's consuming, but it's the way in which it consumes water. It's twofold. Airside cooling, which is kind of what it sounds like. It's more power intensive than water intensive. So it takes cold air and uses these giant whole house fans and blast cools all the piping and equipment to keep it at the desirable temperature for compute. And then during the hotter times of year, they switch to what's called an evaporative misting, where essentially this light mist is it's being emitted into the air within these data centers, and it's keeping everything at the desired cool temperature. Everybody is probably going there, but as our climate is changing, we're seeing more extreme weather, which portends more much hotter summer, but hotter days across the year. If you're familiar with Central Oregon's climate, it's characterized as having cool nights even through the summer, and then this kind of gradual heating to where the middle of the day it's as hot as it's going to be, and then tapers back off significantly into the evenings. That isn't happening the way that it used to. I've lived in Bend for about 20 years, and I remember many years our small 100-year-old house. It was easy to just open the windows at night. It would cool off. You could sleep soundly, and then close them for the day, keep the cool air trapped in, and repeat. That isn't the case any longer. We recently made the decision to get an air conditioning unit because it became untenable to deal with the hotter temperatures. So naturally, the extrapolating to these data centers, there's a lot more demand for that evaporative misting than what was originally forecasted. So how much water are we talking about? And Caleb mentioned data transparency. This is based on what we know. Meta, of the two campuses here in Prineville, Meta is much more built out than Apple, though Apple last reported how much water it was consuming back in 2016. We know that since then its data center campus has grown, but to what extent and how much more water it's consuming today, that's unclear to us. But these are significant sums of water. And going back to that total pie of how much water is available for municipal uses, Prineville's made a choice to service these data centers with a large amount of their water, approximately 15% of it. So the municipal allocation, when you think about a city that hopes to be able to grow in many ways, including providing more housing, more workforce housing, some of the decisions that have been made now will affect to what extent they're able to grow in other ways into the future. And that's particularly relevant because right now the city of Prineville is applying through an economic opportunity analysis for more industrial land specifically so that it can attract additional large campus data centers. I mentioned the transparency gap, and this is a big deal. And as I think about what Caleb shared with us, there is so much that we don't know that we need to know to make informed decisions about how much data center business is good for Oregon. There's the sunk costs and realities of what's already here, but now as the governor has convened a task force to come up with policy recommendations for as soon as the 2027 legislative session, we really need to be asking these bigger questions. If we've got close to 100 of them, how many more do we need? What's good for Oregon today and into the future? And is the type of economic driver that our state is going to be well served by? A little bit about the kind of the technical how Prineville's data centers are provided water and then how water is recaptured. So Prineville has this relatively unique system. It's called an aquifer storage and recovery system. So essentially, Caleb mentioned closed loop. We understand that is somewhat of a farce, but the concept is one of a loop. So water is pulled out of groundwater wells and it is run through the data centers for cooling. And then out the other end, it's pumped this big pump and pipes up onto a bluff where there are these drilled holes and it is forced back into the aquifer. And that's what creates the recharge. All of that is happening, being taken from and replenished into the Paulina Valley aquifer. And so in this schematic, there's this like additional element, which is reclaimed water recharge. So there's this extra siphon when the water is at highest demand. So back to summertime, peak temperatures, peak demand. There's another mechanism to kind of like a syringe pull more water off at the diversion point when it is needed. So it's an interesting system. A lot of questions remain back to transparency about what is being forced back into the aquifer. A lot of questions about the chemical makeup of that water, though we're told it's all fed through water treatment, kind of many-tiered treatment facility that suggests that it's clean water going back in. But I think the community is right to be skeptical and ask questions about to what extent that's true, because we certainly wouldn't want to end up with a drinking water emergency like Boardman has. One of the other mechanisms of this water system, and this was paid for by Apple, part of their mitigation. So there's a 120-acre wetland complex that it takes the treated water out of the water treatment plant and it puts it into these ponds you can see from the design on the screen. And so some of that water is sinking back into the ground, albeit slowly. Some of it's evaporating, and that can be used when there's need for additional water. It can be pulled off and used for cooling as well. So this kind of the wastewater, the water that's run through the treatment and then into that effluent pond, it is also used as a secondary source. So it is effectively wastewater. Wouldn't want to drink it, but it's been treated to some level, and you're using less kind of first-time fresh water by using this wastewater through the system. I think one of the key points here, these data centers, and this photo sort of sums it up nicely. What's been happening is this kind of gradual amplification of the impacts of these data centers as we understand them to need more power. And as more compute is happening, the temperatures within these data centers is increasing, the need for more water for cooling. It has this kind of cumulative effects consideration that, unlike other industrial uses, warehouses, for example, that are just essentially a shell and you need to keep them cool enough so you can store packages in them, it's a very different calculus when it comes to data centers. So within this Paulina Basin, we've got a finite groundwater system. The pressure during peak demand, so it's we're hearing from farmers, agricultural producers that their water rights during peak use are already being turned off to service more senior users within the basin. So even though agriculture is outside of municipal, there is clearly this kind of cross blending of water that it's lots of straws in the ground is the concept, and some of the wells are running dry already. And then there's this other piece because everything is tied together, right? It's electricity, it's transmission, it's fiber, it's water consumption, and all of that needs a place to land. And so Caleb was talking about the big EXO campus by Amazon, and I was thinking about how that one really flips the script on its head that so far most of these data centers are asking for as much as 250 acres. 250 acres is not nothing, but you could see how the argument could be made that it's a relatively small footprint in the grand scheme when there are tens of thousands of acres of open land. If we could derive so much economic revenue from this small parcel that doesn't have other high priority uses, what's the harm? Well, I don't agree with that rationale, but if you start to think about that at the scale of 1,300 acres, it really breaks that paradigm apart. So for all of us thinking about how we protect these shared resources in our regions, the bigger the scale, the greater the intensity of the resource extraction that's going to come with it. So that's a real head scratcher and something to be aware of. And for us, what comes next at Prineville? Um, as I mentioned, we've got this effort afoot in Prineville. We also are seeing a similar one in Madras, where these cities they're lining back up at the trough because they see this as this big economic driver. Prineville chose to do um, a tax deferral for about 15 years. And so starting this year, the city of Prineville is going to get the full value of those built out campuses to the tune of about $35 million in additional property tax revenue, which is a massive windfall. But we want to work with the community to really think how that can provide um, lasting opportunity for folks in Prineville, because as we've seen, though a lot of the resources are consumed by these databases, the data centers, there's not a whole lot of jobs that comes with them. So there's an opportunity to think about, these are the data centers that are already here. How do we utilize those resources to the best extent we can, and create that kind of long-term opportunity for our communities? So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions anybody has.
So I think we can take two questions that are specific to what Ben has presented on. Um, do you know how many people work at these data centers in your area, Ben?
Yeah, it's about 600 is what's claimed. Those are the full-time jobs and then what's called secondary jobs. And I don't know exactly how they calculate it, but they're jobs that jobs that support those data center jobs. There's twice as many, about 1,200.
And that's 15 data centers.
Yes.
Okay. Two in Bend and 13 in Prineville, I think.
Um, I think they might, well, it's my
Be
understanding.
more than that. Okay. Any other specific questions? All right. We'll go on to Kelsey.
Okay, thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Ben.
I'm gonna mute and I'll get back to changing slides.
Thank you, Ben. My name is Kelsey Shaw Nakama with Tualatin River Keepers. I do our policy and advocacy work primarily in Washington County, where I see it as relatively lucky that our watershed is all within one county. It makes my work a lot easier to focus. We'll say that. But that doesn't mean that each area of the county has the same goals. So that's important to note. At Tualatin River Keepers, our goal and mission is to protect, restore, and enjoy the watershed. So we do that through recreation, through restoration, and then through advocacy work. The picture on this slide is Story Creek and its wetlands. This is located within the parcel of land that the legislature most recently tried to bring into our urban growth boundary in Hillsborough that would be rezoned as industrial. So we don't have on this side of the west side of the Cascades, we don't have data centers creating wetlands. We have them filling them in. So we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the watershed because it is a little bit smaller. It's not quite as known. A lot of people drive through it on their way to the coast, but don't get off of Highway 26 or whatever route you're using. So the watershed covers about 712 square miles. And the river is almost 90 miles long and is fed by 900 miles or more of tributary streams. Its headwaters are in the Coast Range, and they begin at about 2,000 feet, and then they drop almost that entire distance, about 1,800 feet, to the valley floor within that first 15 miles or so. And from there, it descends less than 200 feet on its way down to the Willamette. The name Tualatin is actually derived from the name given to the river by the Atqualati, a tribe of Kalapuya Native Americans who made their home in the Tualatin Valley. And that name translates to lazy or sluggish, which is very apt. It very aptly describes the slow and meandering nature of this river. So during the summer, flow is very tightly controlled by Clean Water Services, which is the water resources management utility for Washington County, through releases from the reservoirs that you can kind of see on the bottom left area of that map. And this river system provides drinking water for more than 458,000 residents in the watershed, primarily from the river, and then in the summer, when the flow is a little bit more constricted, from those reservoirs. To get an idea of how many people that is relative to the entire watershed, the county and the watershed has a population of about 600,000. So most people are getting their drinking water from the river. Predominant uses of the land, it's hard to say traditionally, everything changes over the decades, but over the last 20 years or so was about 20% urban, 30% agriculture, and 50% forestry. But like I said, this is changing pretty rapidly right now. But something that the Tualatin Valley is very well known for is our rich soils, and that is what contributes to our productive agricultural sector. A lot of people go into Washington County to go to those U-pick farms during the fall to, find your pumpkin or get your produce. You can go to the next slide. So I will say most of my slides tonight are going to be pictures of maps. I think it's really nice visual to see how things are changing. So the picture in the upper left-hand corner of the screen is from May 2010, while the one in the bottom right is from February 2025. And you can just see how many buildings are going in. This is Hillsborough. These are primarily data centers and other types of industrial buildings. So while the footprint of industry as a whole, primarily tech industry, is growing, the footprint of the individual buildings themselves are also growing. To accommodate more growth, the city is, and along with our state legislators, regularly push to expand the urban growth boundary around Hillsborough. Right now, it runs pretty much along that upper left corner of the bottom right picture. Just kind of complicated orientation there, but where that you can see there's more fields, that's where our urban growth boundary stops. It's a pretty obvious line when you're looking at it from above. Last session, Senate Bill 1586 sought to bring 1,700 acres that are currently rural reserves, so mostly farmland, into the urban growth boundary to be rezoned as industrial. It's directly adjacent to where all of our data centers are. And while there was language in the bill that claimed there was going to be no standalone data centers allowed, there was a obvious loophole for those people who knew, or people I learned from how to read between the lines, is those data centers could be accessory to other types of buildings. So it could be accessory to an office building or a different type of warehouse. So there could still be data centers. Let's see, I think that, go to the next slide. So all of these red markers on the map are the data centers in this mostly same area. Where they're all kind of concentrated there in the middle is where we were looking on those last maps. The Hillsborough cluster of data centers is the most diverse in the state as far as company ownership. There are about 31 data centers owned and operated by 15 different companies. Many of these are co-location data centers. So, the apartment style ones where there's the building landlord and they rent out space within their data center to different tenants, which are smaller companies. The largest of these firms in the area right now is Flexential. It boasts about 1.5 million square feet within the area for their data center footprint. The second largest is Stack Infrastructure. They own 3 different campuses and occupy about 93 acres in Washington County land. They are incentivized to be in this area through generous tax incentives, cheap electricity, and connectivity to the Trans-Pacific Cable Network. So that's those giant fiber optic cables that run underneath the Pacific Ocean, connecting Asia and other places on the other side of the Pacific to the United States. A lot of those pop up in Hillsborough, and there's a claim that having the tech industry there, including data centers, makes their operations that much faster. We're still working on finding evidence that shows that that's actually true. All the data centers in our watershed have to be within the urban growth boundary because outside is that rural reserve. So that means they are all on our municipal systems for water, both in terms of intake. So someone in the chat earlier had asked about water rights. Water rights are not really at issue here because they are just tapped into our drinking water system for intake. And so we're not worried about wells or groundwater from them particularly. And then all their wastewater goes into our municipal sewer system. We go to the next slide. This map shows the waterways and wetlands in the same area. So we briefly touched on this in these other presentations, but in general, data centers' water footprints includes information from 2 different categories. That's the water used directly by the data center, including input and output, and then water used indirectly. So water used by power plant facilities that supply power. In Oregon, that's, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 35% of our power comes from hydropower. So there's a lot of water involved, not to mention all the other types of power need water in their systems, whether that's to push steam through or, water is used in all of our power generation. And it also includes the water consumption during manufacturing process or the manufacturing process of processor chips, which are needed for the IT hardware within data centers. So water is going in everywhere here. Because there's so much water prevalent, there's a lot of people and organizations and coalitions studying those 2 areas of water use by data centers. And so I'm trying to focus on a little bit smaller, but equally important part of the water use. And that's the third category. And that's the displacement and disruption of the water cycle. Still working on a cleaner title for that, but that's what I'm going to call it. So this is another map, shows the FEMA flood hazard zone and the National Wetlands Inventory. A lot of colors on here. Light blue is the 1% annual chance flood hazard area. Dark blue is regulatory floodways. Yellow is the 0.2% annual flood hazards, so less chance. Light green is freshwater emergent wetlands. Dark green is forested or shrub wetlands. Light blue, lavender kind of color, they're all layered, so it's kind of hard to see some of these. Are freshwater ponds, and then purple lakes. So obviously this area is very wet. That is the nature of having a flat, slow river. It spreads itself out. And a lot of the wetlands are relatively small, but they're just as important. Small wetlands provide dispersed ecological benefits and shouldn't be written off in the name of development. Ecologically, small wetlands enhance connectivity by acting as stepping stones within habitat mosaics. They link larger ecosystems, facilitate wildlife movement, species dispersal, and the maintenance of genetic diversity between those species. Can you go to the next slide? All right, so displacement and disruption of a watershed. When industry and data centers, what we're focusing on, goes into an area that was either farmlands or wetlands with lots of streams and riparian areas, those wetlands have to be dredged and filled and dewatered, which is just as bad as it sounds. So when this happens, this reduces the surface water retention areas. So we lose flood resilience. It negatively impacts the ability of that surface water to slowly get filtered into our groundwater and disrupts the reabsorption in general. And then, like I was saying, it's loss of important habitat or wildlife habitat. With this construction comes hundreds of acres of new impervious surfaces. So this increases stormwater runoff when the water, precipitation, snow, whatever sort of water event hits the surface of these impervious surfaces. It's not going to be absorbed into the groundwater. It's going to flow and create essentially unofficial streams in areas that aren't prepared to have them, and that leads to increased erosion. And we've seen that effect, over the last few decades from residential development as well in our area, where the streams are creating the runoff is creating what is known as head cuts, where it meets the river, the bank just erodes farther and farther back, creating canyons in some places. And for people who live along the river, they're losing feet of land into the river at times. This impedes groundwater reabsorption, and all these new roads that you can see on these maps in particular, the top one being from 2010, the bottom, the most recent, you can see a lot of not only new roads, but the roads that were there being expanded and bigger. These roads introduce new contaminants into the watershed, such as 6-ppdq, which is what we've injected into tires over the last few decades to make them not crack. But turns out as those tires wear down when you're driving, that 6-ppdq contaminant is released into the water, and it has been shown to be acutely toxic to coho salmon. And the streams in this area are salmon-bearing streams. These impacts are a little less studied, so we're working still to collect the right data. So yeah, you can see the increased amount of roads. All these roads, when it was in farm country beforehand, were either gravel or they were fields. The map running through the middle is just to show you where those traditional waterways ran. And a lot of those smaller streams have either been buried and put into culverts or just filled entirely, and the larger streams channelized. So they just don't they don't have the same ecological, they aren't able to provide the same ecological services this way. So the other part of the wetlands that are important is that they act as natural sponges. They absorb extra rainfall, they reduce the risk of flooding, and they manage the stormwater runoff. And so as all these farmlands are converted to industrial sites, that runoff will increase the properties risk flooding if these former permeable lands converted to impermeable concrete jungles. And with these wetlands being filled at such an alarming rate, there's really no chance to mitigate this. Oregon has a mitigation program, but that mitigation ratio is like for 1 acre filled, they have to mitigate or buy credits to build or improve 1 acre of wetlands somewhere else. That's great, better than nothing, but those new wetlands do not provide the same services as the ones that have been filled. It takes a long time for a wetland to be very productive, and to put it in somewhere else doesn't have the same impact in the place that it's being taken from. All right, can you go to the next slide? So this is like a little case study. This one is still in the process of being built, so a lot of the information about the amount of wetlands being filled is readily available, so it makes it an easy case study for us to look at today. This is the Crane Data Center that's being built in Forest Grove. There are 2 buildings that are permitted on this site. Each of them are about 180,000 square feet. One of them is going to be 2 stories, so doubling square footage, makes it one of the tallest buildings in the entire city of Forest Grove. And then in the bottom left side or area of the site, it's going to be a new electrical substation. When complete, they'll have permanently filled about 55,642 square feet or 1.28 acres of wetlands, and will have created approximately 29.35 acres of new impervious surface. If you go to the next slide, we can see those red shaded areas are where the wetlands that are existing are going to get filled. And it's an interesting process to me because they're building this in phases. And while they're building one, they're protecting the other, the wetlands that are in the other areas, only to then fill them once they get to that phase. So that language sometimes can appease people, but in reality, like in the end, they're all going to get filled. This site is directly north of Fernhill Wetlands, which is an important wetland similar to the one that Ben was describing that is connected to a wastewater plant. So the treated water that's coming out of this plant goes through the wetland. It cools down. When I toured this plant, or this wetland, like I think 10, 15 years ago, the scientist giving us the tour said that a water molecule released from the plant takes 10 years to reach the river itself. And during that time, it's being cooled and it's, picking up all the micronutrients that makes it actually healthy to the river system. And this isn't water related, but I think it's equally important to note that you can see in the bottom right kind of area of this picture, there's that loop. That's a track. That is part of the Neil Armstrong Middle School campus. So these data centers are going to be direct neighbors to a middle school. All right, next slide. Well, a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 6 months to a year, really diving into this rabbit hole of data center information, is trying to collect data that's specific to our watershed, so that when we talk to legislators and lawmakers and policymakers and presenting to audiences like this one, we can have data that's tailored to where we are and what we're living through. Doing this right now means a lot of records requests. As we've said multiple times, transparency is an issue here. So we're like having to claw for this information as opposed to it being readily available to us. So we started with record requests to the Hillsborough Water Department and the Tualatin Valley Water District, which service the various centers in Hillsborough, for the volume of water. We're still working on analyzing this. You can see some of the numbers here. Take those with a grain of salt, not quite a boulder, but a grain of salt, because a lot of this is dependent on my math, and that's, not my strong suit. But trying to figure out, just have an idea of how much water is being used, because it's not as easy to find as we want it to be. I liked your graphs, Caleb, and I'm gonna now remember how to use Excel. It's been a while, but we'll get there. You can see some discrepancies that we're seeing that we're kind of confused about and trying to figure out how best to push back on some of these record requests that we've received, or the reports we've received back. Hillsborough Water Department claims that for 18 addresses that they service, they're using 50 to 57 million gallons of water in these respective years. Meanwhile, Tualatin Valley Water District gave us the full meter data for 4 addresses, and is significantly more water use for those 4 versus the 18. There's a discrepancy there. We're trying to figure out what that is. Why is that such a big difference? As far as the wetlands go, trying to figure out which wetlands or how much wetlands have been filled, it's harder information to collect. I started with sending a record request to the Department of State Lands looking for various development permits to figure out how, because they have to declare that in some of the development permits that DEQ and other organizations have to approve. I received about half the results for about half the addresses that I requested. The other records for the other half have been purged according to the DSL record storage procedures. I don't know where that information goes, if it's collectible somewhere else. So these are things I'm continuing. It just creates more and more questions and more holes to go down. And for the records that I've received, the reports don't always match up with the addresses that are with what we know are at the addresses now. So either it's the record for the wrong project or a project that has been replaced since the report that they gave me with the data center. So we're looking for a new method to collect this information. If you have any ideas on that, I would gladly accept them. My email's on the slide in a few slides from now. So we can go to the next slide, and I'll go over this quickly because Catherine's going to go through a lot of this in her policy conversation. For me, I'm just continuing to talk to people, to ask new questions and collect information. We're talking with our Clean Water Services, again, on industrial discharge permits. Where are we at with that? Turns out there wasn't data centers weren't a class in and of itself, so they don't have data specific to that, and they're kind of retroactively trying to fix that gap of knowledge. So working with them for that. There's a lot of coalition building. If you guys are interested in getting involved, there's a lot of different levels at which you can get involved. At the local level, state, regional, federal, this problem is being really, there's a spotlight on it right now, which is great. And then advocating for local ordinance and code reforms. We want to see a better public review process, where, you know, we as residents have a longer and a more publicized way or time to get involved with the review process, so that before they're approved by the state or by the local level, we can say whether or not we want that there. Someone in the chat had mentioned voting on these data centers. This is like a way to vote on it, is by being able to provide public comment on the development process. And we want that to be more obvious. We also want cities to do zoning reviews. So with the site in in Forest Grove with the Crane Data Center, that the reason that could be built there is because that area, that specific parcel of land, had been zoned industrial when the first zoning maps were put out in Forest Grove in the 80s. It had not been reviewed. So even though residential areas and a middle school have all built up around that, that little parcel is still industrial. I personally and professionally don't think that that should be the case. I think that that should have been reviewed and changed based on the context of the area around it. This zoning review process is part of our land use program, but it requires funding. And as we all know, funding is hard to come by. So figuring out how to get that part of our land use program funded so that these cities have the time and the resources to do a zoning review. And then advocating for regulations on the state level for data center construction and resource consumption, like we've talked about. I won't go into too much detail on these because I think Catherine will. But these are other things that we're working on at a policy, like an advocacy level. And then my last plug for being involved is we highly encourage residents in these areas to attend city council meetings and to talk to your local planning commission, both at the city level and the county level. That is where right now our voices have the biggest impact. And I highly encourage getting involved in those entities. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. So I wasn't muted. Fantastic. So I think we're just going to move along. Here we go. This is a section where we're going to talk about actions and what types of actions. I really appreciate the plug for city and county level. I tend to work at the state level. It's wonderful to see that we have a couple legislators here on the line, two of our champions. But we can and should and have to do better. So if you could go to the next slide. Basically, the slide summarizes the issues we've heard about, and each can be addressed with policy or action. We can address the data center developers who operate often under the veil of secrecy, sometimes even hiding the name of the tech company behind the development and using non-disclosure agreements to keep municipalities from releasing this information either, and stifling public debate. Some are more open, but it's been a significant issue. The second is the large amount of water use in the face of scarcity, particularly in Eastern Oregon. The third is, in underwater use, somebody mentioned computer chips, but we're not even counting the amount of water used to make the computer chips, but we really should be accounting for the water that's needed to cool our fossil fuel and nuclear energy plants, because those are incredible water users as well. The unknown levels of pollutants that should be measured are really important. as well as the temperature of this water that often actually just goes up in steam. You can see clouds in the Columbia over the areas in eastern Oregon where they are. There is a high cost to developing new water sources or infrastructure for storage, and that is something that some of the data centers have been helping with. But otherwise, passing costs onto ratepayers, either water ratepayers or electricity ratepayers, can be addressed. And we're not going to get any help from the feds in the next couple of years. The action plan from the federal government is to bypass environmental review and fast track permitting. So next slide. In terms of transparency, there are a variety of websites that I will send with the slides that talk about some specifics, and I've tried to put them in like the disclosure examples that were attempted in Virginia and Illinois as the last bullet on this slide. You can look them up and sort of see what they did. There's a lot of other resources that can provide those things. The amount of water evaporated really does remove the water from the normal cycles of water and groundwater takes a long time to replenish. There's a new concern about PFAS in Hermiston's drinking water, which comes both from a river as well as from the groundwater. And unfortunately, we don't have any federal regulations on the persistent fluorinated chemicals that have been discovered in a variety of locations in Oregon and across the country. Next slide. So getting into some more of these specifics, besides transparency, there are a variety of ways to go about trying to address them. One is a higher level one is requiring environmental impact statements for siting new facilities or for renewing water permits. The current data centers in, for example, the Dells is using municipal water. And perhaps they should be required to get a permit for their usage because they are requiring a marked increase in volume for what the community has been planning for. Requirements to use more water efficient technologies. So some of the data centers that house other tenants actually use more water efficiency, but these new mega centers, there's just, the size alone is going to make that not be very effective. Require them to use non-potable water, which is something that's a concept, but again, in Eastern Oregon, where are you going to get non-potable water? And require fees to support state regulation. So we don't have a big enough DEQ or a water resources department that is supported out of the general fund, and getting them to pay for the types of inspections, the permitting time, and the enforcement would really help our own agencies. Incentivizing water use efficiency is something that there's not a lot of information out there about. And then there was a bill that required any data center using over 30 megawatts to be required to get a permit, even if using municipal sources. So those types of potential policies are out there. Next slide. This map is of the Dalles, which hosts 6 Google data centers. And you can see that the Dog River comes, well, you can't see it, but I know the Dog River comes off Mount Hood. Um, and it is diverted with a pipeline to the Crow Creek Reservoir, which is on Forest Service land and is used as the municipal drinking water for the Dalles. And this is where the Google data centers are getting their water currently. Um, Unfortunately, the Dog River or has endangered species, including salmon. And so trying to increase the amount of water that's diverted doesn't work. They want to raise the dam so that the reservoir can be larger. And Cliff Bentz has put in a bill that hopefully will not move anywhere that says, oh, we can just seed 150 acres around the reservoir to the city. And then, oh my goodness, they wouldn't be required to do an environmental impact statement on increasing the size of the reservoir. So the municipal requirements for accurate forecasting and revenue for cities' water needs and infrastructure is really important to protect the ratepayers, the other residential ratepayers that would normally have enough water if the data centers hadn't moved in. In this circumstances, Google has paid for that aquifer recharge system program, very similar to what was described in the Prineville situation. And they estimate they can take water out of the Columbia, store it in the aquifer to the tune of 160 to up to 400 gallons, million gallons, and then use it during the summer, which would certainly put less strain on the Dog River. That has just been completed, and Google paid 25 million, and the rest of the ratepayers will be paying the rest. But they covered a significant portion of that. Another is to require using the best practicable technology to reduce the amount of water needed. And there are some concerns about the water that's coming off these data centers not to be used for irrigation. Some of the cities are making them go through the sewer treatment programs or the sewer treatment plants. Others are not. And these, again, have pollutants in them and should be measured for. Next slide. Other things that can be done is we have building certification, gold and platinum level that these data centers could be required to build towards. Co-development of new renewable energy sources, which of course would reduce the use of backup generators and water from the fossil fuel sources. So that would be a great policy requirement. Require payment for the water infrastructure, as I mentioned before, and some other concepts you can find on the EU has begun to develop reporting requirements as well as beginning to address other data center regulation. And then the governor's task force on data centers, any of those lines in this presentation, you can click on the ones that have an underline and they go to the link for those resources. And the governor's task force on data centers has been meeting the last Fridays of February and March, and then they will be meeting again this Friday. And they go from 9 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon. So there's a lot of amazing resources as well as policy discussions within those presentations. Next slide. And last but not least, a lot of organizations are calling for moratorium on any new building at all. The last session, through the pressure on data centers and the testimony, There was a moratorium just put on any new tax breaks for data centers in enterprise zones. So not all data centers, but just those that might be built in an enterprise zone, such as the areas in Hillsville, and other places. But this would be a moratorium on building completely. The city of Atlanta, Prince George's County have actually passed resolutions on that. And just yesterday, the state of Maine passed a moratorium, as a short-term moratorium as well, until they can decide what kinds of regulations they want to put into place. Next slide. So we need to take action. I think first and foremost, writing any of your elected officials and saying you are concerned about data centers. The more they hear this topic, the more likely they will to learn about it themselves and to take action. You can use the information from this slide deck and the future 2 webinars that we'll be holding to make specific requests. Will you support, will you introduce any of these concepts? The transparency concept, the moratorium, the requirements for environmental impact assessments, etc. And then the second, go ahead to the next slide. These are some of the co-hosts for our webinar tonight and future webinars. Feel free to join them. Feel free to support them. Pick one that makes sense for you and get involved. I wear the hat of the Mobilizing Climate Act together, and we focus on the state level. So we do regular lobbying at that level. But some of the others are going to work locally. And I didn't put I think it was put in the chat, the Columbia River Keepers, which works locally as well as the entire Columbia River. So that's important actions you can take as well. Next slide. So we have 10 minutes or so for questions. This is how you can reach the speakers. Many thanks to Josh Baker and Lace Thornburg for communication supports. So nobody has their hand raised. Thanks, everybody.
Oh, I see a question, River, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, what do you find to be the most common misinformation coming out from or disinformation that you find coming out from data centers, and what do you think are the most common misunderstandings that the public has about data centers?
Any one person can answer that. I don't have an answer for the latter. I don't know that polls are being done.
I can take a crack at it.
Go ahead,
And
Caleb.
just anecdotally, I see a lot out in the world, and I tried to address it in my section. The notion that these systems are closed loop, that they take in a certain amount of water and somehow they reuse it forever, so they're not consuming water, or that they're not contributing to contamination because they don't consume water, they don't discharge. It seems like a really big misconception that people have, and I think it's hard to see those misconceptions as entirely organic. Right. There's a benefit to the world thinking that your system is closed loop when it's not. The other misconception I see is around the actual economic benefits that these data centers tend to bring. And I can point to an example. The exascale project that I was talking about, the big one,
Mm-hmm.
in the planning around that one, you know, there's a claim that the construction of that exascale project will create 6,400 jobs for 8 years. But the way they get there is they'll create 800 jobs for 8 years. So they count those 800 jobs 8 times, once for every year, right? It's sort of an inflated, misleading, maybe even a dubious claim, right? And as others have mentioned too, it's not always entirely clear how they're getting to their estimates of how many, you know, whatever downstream jobs they're creating in the community once they're up and running. Um, and as a, put yourself in the shoes of like a county commissioner in a rural community. The idea of bringing in 6,400 jobs, well, that could be generationally changing, right? But if you scratch the paint on that car, it turns out there's not a whole lot underneath it.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll add to that too is, and this is I think going to be covered in far more detail in future webinars. Is the with the claim of jobs, there's also this claim of tax benefit, which is crazy to me. Jody Weiser, I think, is going to be a panelist in the future, and she can talk to that. She'll be at the Rumble on the River that Leslie just dropped into the chat, talking about this. But when they're talking about the tax benefit, they're talking about this seemingly big number, couple dozen millions kind of number that they're adding into school systems and things like that. But what they leave out is what would have been the total bill if they had paid their fair share of taxes. So they claim this like great number, but in reality, it's like, yeah, but you're not talking about everything else that you missed. Um, so that's another way that they get around it. A lot of, and like in Hillsborough too, learning, the cities have incentives to bring them in because they get like franchise fees for the different power property, like power components that have to go in and the easements and things like that. So the city is getting money for it, but it's not through the regular tax system. So they don't have to use it in the way that they're supposed to, like that they're dictated to have to use it through the various taxes. Um, so less earmarks on
Thanks.
the funding coming in. And then one last thing, Catherine, you mentioned polling. The Environmental Polling Consortium has started to do more polls related to data centers, and I'd recommend checking that out. I can drop the link to their website in the chat. I talked to their poll creators a few weeks ago about all the issues that I see with data centers, and I think they were kind of using that and talking to other folks about how to build those polls and what issues they need to be looking at.
Great, thank you. Amy, did you have a question?
Actually, Kelsey just answered my question. To me, it seems like the reason they want these data centers is really for property taxes, but she pretty much answered it.
Great. And Zora, you have a question.
Not so much a question, more, oh, it is a question. First of all, thank you so much for the presenters for the data and accumulation. This is hard work. Really appreciate you putting all of this together. Is there something in the works for educational purposes? Because people on the call are often somewhat involved, but regular folks, this is really overwhelming. Is there something like a story map, really for all of Oregon? And not only data centers, but utilities, lines under the Columbia, because all of this is connected. And with that, what I believe River said before is like, what the true cost is. Like, this is what we're giving, and that's what they're taking away. I mean, do you really need to show both sides for people to realize what's really going on? Because the millions of dollars don't mean much anymore because everybody hears big numbers all the time, but they don't understand how that they're impacted personally about that. Is there something like this in the works visually? Because that would be great to put out to a lot of people to understand what's really going on.
I don't know of anything like that, Zora, but something that you mentioned is sort of the crux of data centers, but it could be the most important opportunity that our state's faced in a long time. No singular issue highlights the complexity and the connectivity of all these issues like data centers do. And I think as a land use advocacy organization, which focuses on other issues, but we're often before the legislature talking about land use considerations. And in some ways, we can be quieted because we're this single issue special interest group, and maybe another issue group will get attention because there's a shiny object there. But this has the potential to galvanize the state in new and exciting ways. And I can say that there is a coalition building that is representative of all of these different interests. And it has me really hopeful because collectively this group is becoming a movement to address this issue.
I really appreciate hearing that. And is it for Oregon or also for Washington? I was just yesterday at a science symposium from the Yakama Nation, and same data center came up. And there, because we're sharing the Columbia River, it's really an effort on both state sides. And obviously, different legislator, but coming together as a coalition to address both sides.
Yeah, the group that I mentioned is Oregon specific, and I don't know if anything is in the works more broadly, so I can't say whether that's happening.
Thank you.
Yeah, Zora, I would check out like as far as like cross state, Columbia River Keepers does a lot of that work because their watershed covers both sides. And they've been working with groups and to understand what's happening in both states. And Washington is like I would say like a year ahead of Oregon as far as what they've done. Their advisory council was pulled together the year before, like it was 2025. They had some legislation going through the state last year that didn't get passed, but pushed the needle towards more open transparency and things like that. And the Yakama Nation participated in that. The Washington Governor's Council, our advisory committee, I can't remember what they called it, and produced a thorough report on that I'd recommend looking up too.
Great. Ben, would you see if there's another slide?
Let's see. I don't believe so.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, is that it?
Oh, I thought there might be one. So we have the next save the date, May 21st, for a webinar on economics and land use implications of data centers. We will have a tax expert, and that has already been mentioned. So put that in your calendar, and when you get the slides, you can click on that register here link and register. We will send out the slides and the recording to people who've registered. And really appreciate all your wonderful questions. So River, do you have one last one for us?
So I just had one last, I just wanted to follow up on the comment about how data centers connect everything. Because I didn't find this out through environmental. I'm active in indivisible, in privacy, and immigration issues, and data centers are actually a huge thing in that because what data centers are used for are processing data, and it's your data that they're processing. So it's just, yeah, I just really wanted to expand on that because I thought it was incredibly important for people to understand that it's not just limited to environmental. Data centers are probably one of the most expansive impacts that we can possibly have. They connect literally to every aspect of your life, from your utilities to immigration to your consumer rights, your right to own. Just it goes on and on. So yeah, no, these are huge.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the stealing of your or use of your own data,
Mhm.
and so on, that kind of goes on and on. I think that we
Yeah.
all have to soul search about how we're going to use AI, which is the next exascale or whatever you called that, Caleb. And I switched to DuckDuckGo because I could turn off the AI easily. Uh, and I don't need it, but on rare occasions. So I think we really need to examine what we want for Oregon. Do we really want it to be number 2 or 3 in the world for data centers? Um, and how do we draw the line? There's a lot of questions on many levels. So thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. And thank you to our experts in their parts of Oregon.
Thank you.
And we'll see you at the next one, or join up or email us if you want to get more engaged sooner. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Great job. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Uh, River, another resource you might watch is the Rumble on the River from January talking about data centers. The first speaker really spoke to the what AI and what data centers represent in our larger like military industrial complex, and I thought did an excellent job of kind of placing this industry within the larger context of our society right now.
Awesome. I will definitely have to do that. And I'm going to try and be at the next one of these and maybe the next one of those. What my schedule gets crazy, but sometimes with meetings. But I will definitely be trying to at least stay in the list so I can get the follow-up emails. I really appreciate you guys doing that because sometimes schedules just don't work out and you've got 4 things on the calendar. Ask me about my day tomorrow. So
That's great.
I appreciate it so much. And I'll be sharing this with all the groups because I think it's really important. Also, thank you guys for the explanation on the water contaminants. I've been trying to talk to my husband about that and being like, no, they're contaminants. We're getting a lot of anecdotal evidence from people living around it about how their water is getting brown. He's like, but how is that happening? And you guys finally answered that. And he was like, okay, that makes sense. So I cannot thank you enough for ending that discord in my home, which I is the sole purpose of why you presented it. But still, I really appreciate it. It was an excellent presentation, even as I was having massive connectivity issues, but appreciated it so very much. And hopefully, I'll find a way to get us to work together and we can really push this issues because I have so many privacy concerns.